Story 1. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow across the sky as I stirred the pot of spaghetti sauce bubbling away on the stove. The aroma of garlic and tomatoes filled the kitchen, and I couldn't help but smile, thinking about the evening ahead. Tommy, my 7-year-old son, was outside playing with his friends in the yard, blissfully unaware of the world's darker corners. As I glanced out the window, I could see him chasing after a soccer ball, laughter ringing clear and bright in the early evening air. "Mom, look at this," he shouted, kicking the ball with all his might. I chuckled, shaking my head at his boundless energy. "Just be careful, okay?" I called back, my voice slightly strained with a mother's worry. The neighborhood had always felt safe, a cozy pocket of Los Angeles where families thrived and children played. But recently, a string of unsettling news reports had begun to trickle through our lives like a dark cloud. I tried not to think about it while I cooked, focusing instead on the comforting sounds of Tommy's laughter and the smell of dinner. Just as I turned back to the stove, a strange noise jolted my attention, a soft rustling sound that seemed out of place amidst the usual evening tranquility. I furrowed my brow and stepped toward the window, peeking through the lace curtains. My heart quickened as I caught sight of the figure next door. Richard Ramirez. He was standing there, a silhouette against the fading light, his face illuminated by the last rays of the sun. He was smiling, that unnerving grin that never quite reached his eyes. It sent a chill down my spine. I had seen him around before, mingling with neighbors, always so charming and friendly. But something about that smile tonight felt wrong, as if he was aware of secrets I couldn't begin to fathom. "Sarah, dinner's ready?" Tommy's voice broke through my moment of unease, pulling me back to reality. I turned away from the window, shaking off the eerie feeling that had settled in my stomach. "Coming?" I called, forcing a smile as I returned to the kitchen. As we sat down to eat, I tried to push the thought of Richard out of my mind. "How was school today?" I asked, watching Tommy tuck into his spaghetti with gusto. "It was great. We learned about dinosaurs. Did you know some were bigger than our house?" he exclaimed, eyes wide with excitement. "Really? That's huge," I replied, trying to match his enthusiasm. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the image of Richard's smile. The news had been filled with stories of missing persons lately, and I found myself glancing toward the window more often than I cared to admit. Later that night, after Tommy had gone to bed, I found myself sitting on the couch with a book in hand, though I wasn't really reading. My thoughts drifted back to my neighbor. I remembered how he had moved in only a few months ago, how the other neighbors had welcomed him with open arms, charmed by his charisma. But there was something unsettling about him, a sense of darkness that lingered just beneath the surface. Suddenly, a loud thump echoed from outside, breaking the stillness of the night. My heart raced as I stood up, hesitating for a moment before making my way to the window again. I peered outside and my breath caught in my throat. Richard was outside, his silhouette now more defined in the glow of the porch light. He seemed to be standing still, gazing into the darkness, an inscrutable expression on his face. What was he looking at? The shadows of the trees danced eerily in the light, but I realized he wasn't watching them. He was waiting. Waiting for something, or someone. I felt a chill creep up my spine, and I quickly pulled the curtain shut, retreating back into the safety of my living room. "Just relax," I whispered to myself, trying to convince my racing heart to calm down. But as I settled back onto the couch, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. In a neighborhood that had always felt like home, the sense of unease grew heavier with each passing moment, leaving me trapped between the warmth of my home and the chilling reality that lurked just next door. The block party buzzed with excitement, the air thick with the smell of grilled burgers and the laughter of children chasing each other through the yard. I stood at the edge of my driveway, flipping burgers on the grill, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me since the news reports about the recent disappearances. Tommy was off somewhere with his friends and I could hear his laughter, a sweet sound that momentarily soothed my worries. "Hey Sarah," Richard called out, his voice smooth and inviting. I turned to see him approaching, a plate of plastic cups in one hand and a charismatic smile plastered on his face. Clad in a simple black t-shirt and jeans, he resembled any other neighbor, but there was something about his smile that felt off, like a mask hiding something sinister. "Hi Richard," I replied, forcing a smile, though my heart raced in my chest. "You're here to help, right?" "Of course. Let me give you a hand," he said, stepping closer. The charm in his voice was hard to resist, and I found myself handing him a spatula. "Just flip those every few minutes and we'll have a feast." As he took over the grill, I couldn't help but notice how easily he blended into the gathering. He struck up conversations with other neighbors, laughing and joking, his laughter ringing out like a bell. I watched him for a moment, a pang of discomfort washing over me. How could someone so seemingly perfect exist amidst the shadows of recent crime reports? I shook my head, forcing the thoughts away. Maybe I was just being paranoid. "Sarah, did you hear about that poor girl who went missing?" A neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, asked as she approached me, her brow creased with worry. "It's so unsettling. We've lived here for over 20 years and nothing like this has ever happened." "I know," I replied, trying to maintain a calm demeanor. "But we have to keep our spirits up. It's just a coincidence, I'm sure." Richard, overhearing our conversation, chimed in, "You know, people get scared during times like these. But we can't let fear control us. We need to look out for each other, right?" His words rang with sincerity, and I felt a strange sense of trust in him, despite everything I had seen on the news. I nodded, trying to convince myself that he was just another neighbor looking out for the community. "Yeah, you're right. We should stick together." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the party continued to swell with laughter and chatter. I found myself preparing a large salad at the table, the clinking of bowls and the distant sound of music filling the air. Richard wandered over, his hands now free of grilling duties. "Need any help?" he asked, his eyes sparkling as he leaned against the table. "Just chopping veggies," I said, gesturing to the cutting board. "How about you tell me what you do for fun? I feel like I hardly know you." He chuckled, leaning closer as if sharing a secret. "I like to explore. There are so many hidden spots in LA that people don't know about. I could show you sometime if you're interested." I hesitated, my instincts flaring. "Maybe. I'll have to check my schedule." Just then Lisa, the local journalist, came bustling over, her notebook in hand. "Sarah, have you heard anything new about the missing girl?" she asked, concern etched on her face. "Just what's been on the news, Lisa." "What?" I asked, feeling a sense of unease creeping back in. "I'm working on a piece, trying to understand the patterns in these disappearances," she said, glancing at Richard. "You know, it's strange how sometimes the people closest to us can hide the darkest secrets." Richard's gaze flickered to Lisa, a moment of tension passing between them before he broke into a smile. "That's a bit morbid, don't you think? I believe the world is filled with good people." "Maybe," Lisa replied, her expression skeptical. "But sometimes those good people aren't who they seem." As the evening progressed, I found myself lost in the chaos of the block party, laughter and music drowning out my concerns. Yet, in the back of my mind, Lisa's words echoed like a haunting refrain. My trust in Richard felt like a fragile thread, ready to snap at any moment. When the party began to wind down, a neighbor rushed over, breathless and panicked. "Has anyone seen Rachel?" The air went still, the laughter fading as the weight of his words settled over us like a heavy fog. My heart raced, dread pooling in my stomach. The atmosphere shifted, and the once jovial gathering turned into a hushed murmur of concern. I glanced at Richard, who was now watching the commotion with an expression that I couldn't quite place. Was it curiosity or something darker? I felt my heart drop as I realized that the trust one had built with this seemingly perfect neighbor was beginning to crumble, just like the fabric of safety I had wrapped around my family. A chill ran down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something dreadful was lurking just beneath the surface of our quiet lives. The evening air was thick with tension, a heaviness that settled over the neighborhood like a dark cloud. I could feel it in my bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Detective Ramirez, my childhood friend, leaned against the hood of his cruiser, his brow furrowed in concern as he delivered the unsettling news. "Mike, the missing person. She was last seen near here. There's more to this than we thought," he said, his voice low and serious. "Her name is Emily. She's connected to a string of unsolved murders. I don't want to alarm anyone, but I suggest you keep a close eye on your neighbors." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. The memories of my days on the force flooded back, the faces of victims lingering in my thoughts. "Are you sure? I mean, it's just a missing person report, right? People go missing all the time." "No, Mike. This isn't just people missing. We're talking about a pattern. A darkness that's creeping closer to home." He paused, his eyes scanning the street, landing on Richard's house. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but I can't shake the feeling that he's involved. As if on cue, I spotted Sarah in her backyard, her son Tommy playing with Richard. My heart sank. Tommy was innocent, blissfully unaware of the danger that lurked so close. "Damn it," I muttered under my breath. "Why is she letting him play with that guy?" I walked towards her, feeling a sense of urgency pushing me forward. "Hey, Sarah." I called out, my voice forced to sound casual, though my insides churned with unease. "How's it going over there?" She looked up, a smile breaking across her face. "Oh hi Mike. Just keeping an eye on the boys. They're having a blast." She gestured toward Tommy, who was tossing a ball back and forth with Richard, who wore that infuriatingly charming smile of his. "Yeah, I can see that," I replied, forcing a chuckle. "Just be careful, okay? You never know who you're dealing with." "Are you suggesting Richard is dangerous?" she asked, tilting her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. "He's been nothing but nice to us." My stomach twisted. "I know it sounds paranoid, but things have been happening around here. You've heard the news, right? The missing girl? Unsolved cases." Her expression softened, but there was a flicker of doubt. "I don't want to think the worst of anyone, Mike. Richard seems normal. He helps out with the yard work and brings over baked goods. He's just a nice guy." "Nice guys can hide dark secrets," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Just promise me you'll keep your guard up." Okay. "I hear you," Sarah replied, though her voice held a hint of skepticism. "I'll be careful." As I turned away, frustration bubbled within me. I couldn't shake the sense that something terrible was brewing. I needed to speak with Lisa, the journalist who had been digging into the recent crimes. If anyone could help illuminate the shadows, it was her. Later that evening, I found her at the local diner, her notebook spread out before her. "Mike," she exclaimed, her eyes lighting up with recognition. "You won't believe what I've found." "Let me guess. Something about our friendly neighbor?" I asked, sliding into the booth across from her. "More than that," she said, lowering her voice. "I've been interviewing neighbors and the stories I'm gathering, they don't add up. I think Richard is hiding something." I leaned in closer, my heart racing. "Like what?" "Like his past. There are rumors of strange behavior. People have seen him lurking around at odd hours, and he has a history that doesn't quite match the charming persona he's projecting." I nodded, my instincts kicking in. "I've been feeling uneasy about him too. I don't know what it is, but something feels off." Just as I was about to share my own concerns, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night, shattering the calm of our conversation. The diner fell silent, and the tension in the air became palpable. "What the hell was that?" Lisa whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I shot up from the booth, my heart pounding in my chest. "We need to check it out. Now." As we rushed outside, the scream echoed again, sending the neighborhood into a frenzy. People poured into the streets, faces pale and terrified. My mind raced with the possibilities of what we might find. In that moment it became clear. The nightmare was no longer just a possibility, it was a reality, and it was unfolding right before our eyes. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when I found myself standing in the middle of our street, the air thick with tension. A few neighbors had gathered, their faces painted with concern, their whispers weaving a tapestry of dread that enveloped us all. Richard was there too, his casual demeanor seeming almost out of place amid the rising unease. "I just want to help find her," he said, his voice smooth like butter, almost too calm for the circumstances. I watched as he offered his assistance, and the neighbors, desperate for any semblance of hope, nodded in agreement. "Thanks for stepping up, Richard," Mike said, his voice steady despite the turmoil swirling around us. I could see the shadow of doubt lurking in his eyes, but he masked it well. I stood silently beside him, my heart racing as I tried to shake off the gnawing feeling in my gut that Richard was more than he appeared. As the search party formed, I found myself drifting toward the edge of the group, my instincts screaming for me to keep my distance. "Sarah, are you okay?" Mike asked, concern etched on his face. "You seem a bit off." "I'm fine," I replied, forcing a smile that felt foreign on my lips. "Just tired, I guess." But the truth was, I hadn't slept well since the news of the missing girl broke. Night after night, I was haunted by the same chilling dreams, visions of Richard lurking in the shadows, his eyes glinting with malice. I could still feel the goosebumps rising on my arms as I recalled the last dream, where he had reached out to me, beckoning me into the dark. As we began our search, I could see Richard moving effortlessly among the neighbors, laughing and chatting, a charming mask that concealed whatever darkness lay beneath. "Let's check the alleyway behind my house," he suggested, leading a group of our neighbors with an air of authority. I felt a strange mix of anger and fear bubbling inside me as I watched him take charge. How could they not see? How could they not sense the danger he posed? "Sarah, do you want to help me check the park?" Lisa's voice broke through my thoughts, her eyes darting nervously toward Richard. "I think it might be better if we stick together." I nodded, grateful for her presence, and we moved away from the group, trying to distance ourselves from Richard's charismatic pull. "Have you found anything yet?" I asked, scanning the park for any signs of struggle. Lisa shook her head, her expression grim. Not a thing. But I've been digging into Richard's past. Something's not right, Sarah. I can feel it. What do you mean? I whispered, glancing back to where Richard stood, now animatedly discussing something with another neighbor. You seem so normal. You think he's involved? I'm not sure. But there's a pattern in the disappearances. They all have ties to him, direct or indirect. I'm still piecing it together, but it's like he's at the center of it all, she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. The weight of her words settled heavily on my chest, and I couldn't shake the image of Richard's smile from my mind. Suddenly, a chill ran down my spine as I noticed something odd. A symbol carved into the trees near Richard's house, something I hadn't seen before. It looked almost like a sigil, and it sent a wave of nausea through me. Lisa, look, I said, pointing toward the tree. What do you think that is? She squinted at it, her brow furrowing in concentration. I don't know, but it definitely looks out of place. We should take a closer look, but let's be careful. As we approached the tree, my heart raced. The symbol seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and I could feel the air thickening around us. This is unsettling, Lisa murmured, reaching out to touch the carving. It feels like it's watching us. I don't like this, Lisa. We should go back, I urged, glancing over my shoulder to ensure Richard wasn't watching us. The last thing I needed was for him to suspect that we were onto him. Just a little closer, she insisted, her curiosity getting the better of her. I hesitated but followed her lead, my instincts screaming at me to retreat. As we leaned in, the shadows deepened around us, and I had the overwhelming sensation that we weren't alone. Suddenly, a loud shout echoed from the direction of Richard's house, pulling us back to reality. The search party was in disarray, and I could see Richard's figure moving swiftly, his expression shifting from concerned neighbor to something darker in the blink of an eye. What's happening? I asked, my voice trembling. I don't know, but we'd better find out, Lisa replied, her eyes wide with fear. We exchanged a look of unspoken understanding before racing back toward the chaos, our hearts pounding in sync with the dread that had settled over our neighborhood. The air in our neighborhood had thickened with unease, an invisible shroud that pressed down on us all. It was as if the walls had ears and the shadows held secrets. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than not, especially when I was outside. Richard's behavior had become a source of concern, and I could no longer dismiss the unsettling feeling in my gut. The disappearances were no longer whispers. They had turned into shouts echoing through the streets, each one a reminder that danger was lurking closer than we dared to believe. One evening, I stood on my porch, staring into the dimly lit street where children used to play. My heart raced with anxiety as I thought of Tommy. He was blissfully unaware of the terror brewing just beyond our neighborhood. I needed to talk to Mike. He might have insights I hadn't considered. As I walked over to his house, I could feel the weight of my fears pressing in around me. Hey, Mike, I called as he stepped out, a frown creasing his forehead. Can we talk? Sure, Sarah. What's on your mind? He motioned for me to sit on his porch swing. The creaking of the wood felt like a ghost from a better time, a stark contrast to the dread hanging over us. I've been thinking about Richard. His behavior, there's something off about him. I can't shake this feeling, I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. And with all these people disappearing, it feels connected. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I've been thinking the same thing. But what can we do? I'm just a retired officer now. Confronting him could ruin my reputation. Your reputation? Mike, there are lives at stake. What if Tommy were to? I stopped myself, the thought too horrific to finish. I get it, Sarah. Believe me, I do, he replied, his tone shifting to one of urgency. But what if we're wrong? What if we confront him and end up making things worse? Then at least we tried. Ignoring it feels like burying our heads in the sand, I insisted, the weight of my convictions hardening my resolve. As I spoke, I could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between duty and fear. That night I couldn't sleep. The shadows outside my window danced like phantoms, and every creak of the house felt like a warning. My mind reeled with possibilities, each one darker than the last. What if Richard was indeed involved in the disappearances? What if he had done something to Tommy when he played in the backyard? The next day, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I needed to gather more information, to piece together what seemed like an intricate puzzle. Lisa had been investigating Richard, and if anyone had answers, it would be her. I found her at the local cafe, poring over notes with a focused intensity. Lisa, I said, sliding into the seat across from her. I need your help. We can't let this go on any longer. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I saw the fear reflected back at me. I've been looking into him. There's something seriously wrong. I heard strange noises coming from his house last night, and I saw him talking to someone, a man I didn't recognize. Did you get a look at him? I asked, my pulse quickening. No, but I felt it. Something was off. I'm gathering enough evidence to confront him, she said, determination etching her features. Be careful, Lisa. We don't know what we're dealing with here, I warned, but deep down I was proud of her courage. She was the only one willing to look into the abyss. That evening I found myself standing in front of Richard's house. I had come to confront him, or at least to gather more information. As I approached, I heard voices drifting from inside. I crouched down, straining to catch every word. You need to keep them quiet. We can't let anyone find out, I heard Richard say, his tone low and menacing. A chill ran down my spine. Accomplice? What was happening? I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. Just then Richard's gaze snapped toward the window, locking onto mine. A sinister smile spread across his face, a predator's grin that sent me reeling back into the shadows. Frozen in place, I felt the weight of the truth crash over me. This man wasn't just a neighbor. He was a monster hiding in plain sight. The darkness I had sensed was real, and I was standing dangerously close to its edge. I stood at the edge of the chaos, my heart pounding in my chest as I prepared to confront Richard. The atmosphere was electric. It felt as if the very air was charged with fear and anger. My neighbors, once friendly faces, were now twisted with rage, shouting accusations and brandishing makeshift weapons. I took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage I had. Everyone listen to me, I shouted, trying to cut through the din. I have proof. Richard isn't who you think he is. The crowd quieted for a moment, their eyes locking onto me, filled with both curiosity and suspicion. I could see the flicker of doubt in their expressions. Would they believe me? I pushed through the throng, clutching the stack of papers I had gathered over the past few weeks. Reports, witness statements, connections that linked Richard to the missing people. He has been lying to us. I continued, my voice gaining strength. He is not just a nice neighbor. He's a predator. A murmur rippled through the crowd as I raised my voice further. I've seen the patterns. The missing persons, the strange behaviors, he's connected to them all. My eyes darted to Richard, who was standing at the edge of the crowd, a smirk creeping across his face. It was infuriating how he still exuded a sense of calm, as if he found amusement in our fear. Is this true, Richard? Mike stepped forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. What's going on? Richard's gaze shifted from me to Mike, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something, panic perhaps? But it was gone in an instant, replaced by that infuriating grin. Come on, Mike. Don't listen to her. She's just trying to stir up trouble, he said, his voice smooth, dripping with a false sincerity. But the crowd was no longer swayed. The whispers turned into shouts, and before I knew it, someone yelled, "Get him!" And just like that, the mob surged forward, driven by the primal instinct to protect their own. Stay back, Richard shouted, his tone shifting, revealing the menace lurking beneath his charm. You don't know what you're doing. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I pushed forward, intent on exposing him. You're just a coward hiding behind a facade of normalcy, I called out. You think you can get away with this? In that moment, Richard's demeanor shifted. The playful smile was gone, replaced by a chilling glare that sent shivers down my spine. You have no idea who you're dealing with, Lisa, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned to see Sarah, her eyes wide with fear. What's happening? She asked, glancing nervously at Richard. Sarah, you need to get Tommy inside. I urged her, my voice rising above the chaos. He's not safe. Before she could respond, Richard lunged forward, the crowd closing in around him. You think you can just expose me? You think you're safe? His words dripped with malice, and I felt the weight of his threat hang in the air. Richard, stop. Mike shouted, but it was too late. The mob was upon him, pushing and shoving, fueled by a mix of fear and rage. I watched in horror as Richard broke free, darting toward Sarah and Tommy's house. Tommy? Sarah screamed, her voice filled with terror. Get inside now. I yelled, but Richard was faster. He reached her just as she opened the door, grabbing her by the arm. You've all made a mistake, he snarled, his eyes wild. I rushed forward, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Let her go, I shouted, but Richard's grip was like iron. Don't you see? I'm part of this neighborhood too, he spat, his breath hot with anger. You think you can just turn on me? Just then, Mike lunged at Richard, and the two men collided, grappling with each other as the crowd surged forward, caught up in the frenzy. I could feel the panic rising in my throat as I watched, horrified. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, Richard broke free from Mike's grasp, his eyes darting around, searching for an escape. "This isn't over," he shouted, his voice echoing in the night as he bolted down the street. My heart sank. We had uncovered the monster living next door, but the nightmare wasn't over. As the police sirens wailed in the distance, I felt a chill creep down my spine. Who had been helping him? As the crowd began to disperse, I turned to Mike, my breath heavy with dread. "Did you see the way he looked at me?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "He knows we're onto him." Mike nodded, his face pale. "We need to find him before he disappears completely." But as I scanned the crowd, I realized with a sinking feeling that the horror was deeper than we imagined. The unknown accomplice was someone we had trusted, someone who had been hiding in plain sight. The weight of betrayal hung heavy in the air, a dark cloud over our community as we stood there, questioning everything we thought we knew. As the police closed in, Richard vanished into the night, leaving behind a haunting question. Who truly lives next door? Story 2. The sun hung low in the sky as I stood in the backyard, the scent of grilled burgers wafting through the air. The laughter of children mingled with the sizzling sounds of meat on the grill, creating a perfect picture of suburban bliss in Wichita. I waved to my neighbors, their faces illuminated by the golden light of the setting sun, as they gathered around the picnic table, plates in hand. "Hey Dennis, this is the best barbecue yet," shouted Tom, my next-door neighbor, his voice booming with enthusiasm. "Thanks, Tom. Just trying to keep the neighborhood spirits high," I replied, a smile plastered on my face. Inside, however, I felt a different kind of thrill, a pulse that quickened with each laugh and cheer. The facade of the devoted family man was a seamless mask, one that I wore comfortably. As I flipped the burgers, I caught sight of my daughter, Amy, playing with her little brother in the corner of the yard. Their innocent giggles contrasted sharply with the darkness that lingered in the back of my mind. They had no idea, and I had no intention of letting them in on my secret. I let out a soft chuckle, masking the turmoil that churned within me. "Hey kids, come and grab a burger," I called out, and they raced over, leaving a trail of laughter in their wake. As they devoured their food, I engaged in light banter with the adults around me, all while I meticulously plotted my next move. The thrill of the hunt was intoxicating. The planning, the anticipation, it all filled a void that nothing else could. "Dennis, did you hear about that girl who went missing a few blocks away?" Karen, a neighbor with a penchant for gossip, leaned closer to me, her voice lowered. "It's just terrifying. I can't imagine what those poor parents are going through." "Oh, it's awful," I replied, feigning concern. "But I'm sure they'll find her soon. This town is safe." "Are you sure about that?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "I mean, this isn't the first time something like this has happened. You never know who to trust." I chuckled lightly, dismissing her fears with a wave of my hand. "Come on, Karen. You know me. I'm just a regular guy, right?" "Yeah, but you never know." As the evening wore on, the laughter and chatter continued, though my mind drifted elsewhere. I excused myself, stepping into the quiet of the garage, where the shadows loomed larger than life. I pulled out my notebook, pages filled with meticulous notes, sketches, and plans. Each page was a testament to the thrill that drove me, a haunting obsession that I could not shake. I relished the thought of my dark desires, my heart racing at the possibilities. Just then I heard a soft voice behind me. It was little Lily, the girl from down the street, her eyes wide with fear. "Mr. Rader, I heard my mom talking about the missing girl. I'm scared. What if someone takes me?" My heart sank, but I maintained my composure. "Lily, you don't have to worry. I'm here to protect you and everyone else. This is a safe neighborhood, and I'm sure your mom is just being cautious." "But what if it happens again?" she pressed, her voice trembling. I knelt down to her level, forcing a smile. "I promise you nothing will happen. You're safe with me." She nodded, though I could see the uncertainty lingering in her eyes. I ruffled her hair, trying to offer comfort as I felt the weight of my own darkness settling heavily on my shoulders. As night fell and the stars twinkled above, I returned to the party, laughter ringing in my ears. But as I mingled with my neighbors, I couldn't shake the feeling that the air had shifted, that something was coming. The calm before the storm, a storm I had orchestrated in the shadows. I could feel it, the thrill of anticipation building within me, ready to unleash chaos upon this unsuspecting town. And as I looked around at the smiling faces, I couldn't help but think, they have no idea what's lurking just beneath the surface. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a golden hue over the town of Wichita. I stood on the porch, staring into the distance, but my mind was miles away, lost in the thrill of what I had just done. The first strike had sent ripples through the community, and I reveled in the chaos that followed. The body of a young woman had been discovered, and the town was reeling, gripped by fear and confusion. I could hear the distant wail of sirens, the frantic whispers of neighbors who had gathered, trying to make sense of it all. "Did you hear? They found her in the park." One voice trembled, barely above a whisper. I couldn't help but smirk. They were all so oblivious to the truth. As I walked into the living room, Paula looked up from her book, her eyes filled with concern. "Dennis, are you okay? You've been awfully quiet," she said, peering at me over the rim of her glasses. "I'm fine, one. Just thinking about the tragedy," I replied, forcing a frown onto my face. "Can you believe it? Someone could do something so horrible." She nodded, her expression softening. "It's just awful. I can't imagine what her family is going through." "Me neither," I said, suppressing the urge to chuckle. "Life is so unpredictable." That night, I lay in bed, the weight of my actions pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. I could still picture her face, the fear in her eyes as I took her life. It was intoxicating. I closed my eyes, letting the darkness wrap around me, but sleep eluded me. Instead, I replayed every moment in my mind, savoring the thrill of my first kill. Morning broke, and with it came the news. The television flickered to life, showing a somber reporter outside the police station. "Authorities are urging anyone with information to come forward. The community is in shock as they mourn the loss of 21-year-old Anna Murphy." I leaned forward, intrigued. The reporter continued, "Detective John Cleary has been assigned to the case and promises that they will find the person responsible for this heinous act." "Good luck with that, John," I muttered to myself, knowing full well how hard it would be for him to connect the dots. That afternoon I decided to pay my respects. The memorial service was being held at the local church, and as I arrived, I could feel the palpable grief hanging in the air. People were gathered, candles flickering in their trembling hands, their faces etched with sorrow. "Isn't it just heartbreaking?" a neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, said as I approached. "Absolutely," I replied, my voice steady as I feigned empathy. "It's a tragedy we'll never forget." As the service began, I stood quietly, blending in with the crowd. I watched as Anna's family wept, their hearts shattered. I felt a rush of exhilaration. The world around me was draped in mourning, but I was the puppet master pulling the strings. Detective Cleary was there too, a stern look on his face as he scanned the crowd. I noticed his eyes flicker over to me for a brief moment, but I held his gaze with a calm smile. "How's the investigation going, John?" I thought, suppressing a grin. The pastor spoke of loss and hope, words that fell on deaf ears for me. I was lost in my own thoughts, relishing the chaos I had ignited. As the service concluded, I made my way to Anna's grieving mother. "I'm so sorry for your loss," I said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you," she replied, tears streaming down her face. "She was so full of life." "She was," I agreed, my voice dripping with false compassion. Inside, I felt nothing but a rush of satisfaction. As I left the church, I caught a glimpse of Detective Cleary speaking with a group of officers. I could sense his determination. He was piecing it all together, and I was the ghost haunting his investigation. The first strike was merely the beginning. The town would soon learn that the quiet killer was not just a figment of their imagination. I was right here, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. The air was thick with tension as the town of Wichita grappled with the chilling reality that a killer walked among us. As I strolled down the familiar streets, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but the neighborhood appeared as it always did. Quiet, unassuming, filled with the sounds of children playing and dogs barking. Yet, beneath that facade of normalcy, a storm was brewing. "Hey, Dennis." I heard a voice call out. It was Jim, my neighbor, his brow furrowed with worry. "Have you heard about the latest murder? It's got everyone on edge." I forced a smile, my heart racing. Just what we need, right? More fear in the community. I chuckled nervously, but I could see the concern etched on his face. "You should keep your doors locked, though. Better safe than sorry." "Yeah, you're right," Jim replied, his voice trailing off. "I just hope they catch whoever is doing this before it gets worse." He turned to walk away, and I felt a twinge of guilt. How easily I could deflect suspicion, all while hiding the monster lurking within. That evening, as I sat at the dinner table with Paula and the kids, I could sense her unease. She kept glancing at me, her brow furrowed. "Dennis, are you okay? You've seemed a bit off lately." "Off?" I echoed, my voice steady. "What do you mean?" I looked into her eyes, searching for signs of doubt. "I've just been busy with work in the community. You know how it is." Paula nodded slowly, but I could see the uncertainty in her gaze. I just feel like you're not here with us sometimes. Like you're somewhere else. I reached across the table, taking her hand in mine. I'm right here, Paula. It's just a lot of pressure with everything going on. I squeezed her hand, crafting the perfect blend of affection and reassurance. You know I love you and the kids more than anything. Her expression softened, but the nagging feeling of doubt lingered. I couldn't afford for her to see the cracks in my facade. Maybe we should plan a weekend getaway, I suggested, hoping to distract her. Just the four of us. A little family time might do us good. Yeah, that sounds nice, she replied, a hint of relief washing over her face. I'd like that. As the days passed, the police set up a task force, their presence in the neighborhood becoming increasingly noticeable. I watched from my porch as officers canvassed the area, their faces grim. They were desperately seeking leads, and I reveled in the chaos I had sown. Each time I saw their flashing lights, a thrill coursed through me. I was the shadow they were chasing, the ghost that evaded capture. Then one afternoon, as I was tidying up the garage, I overheard a conversation between two detectives. This killer is toying with us, one of them said, frustration seeping through his voice. We need to get inside the mind of whoever this is. I couldn't help but smirk, the thrill of my dark game igniting a fire within me. They had no idea that the monster was right under their noses, living a mundane life, blending seamlessly into the fabric of this town. Later that evening, I received an anonymous letter in the mail, postmarked from a nearby city. My heart raced as I opened it, my hands trembling with excitement. The words were taunting, mocking the very authority that sought to capture me. You'll never catch me, it read. I enjoy the fear I instill in you. It's intoxicating. I felt a rush of exhilaration course through me, the thrill of being in control washing over me. The police might think they were closing in, but I was always a step ahead. I could almost hear Detective Cleary's frustration echoing in my mind as I contemplated the next move. That night, as I lay in bed beside Paula, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, heart pounding, my mind racing with the possibilities that lay ahead. I had to keep my cool, keep up the facade. I had to protect my family even as the darkness threatened to consume me. Dennis? Paula murmured, breaking through my thoughts. Are you okay? You're really restless tonight. I'm fine, I replied, my voice steady. Just a lot on my mind. I turned to face her, forcing a reassuring smile. I promise I'll get some sleep. Just a little stressed with work. She nodded, but I could see the flicker of doubt still lingering in her eyes. I closed my eyes, attempting to calm my racing heart. The shadows of doubt were closing in, both within myself and from those around me. But I was determined to keep my secrets safe no matter the cost. As I walked into the dimly lit room, the air felt thick with tension. Detective John Cleary sat across from me, his eyes sharp and filled with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I forced myself to maintain a calm demeanor. After all, I was just Dennis, the friendly face of Wichita, the devoted family man. Thank you for coming in today, Mr. Rader, he said, his voice steady yet probing. We have a few questions about the recent events in town. Of course, Detective, I replied, a smile creeping onto my face. Anything to help. What can I do for you? I leaned back in my chair, trying to project an image of ease, though I could feel the sweat forming at the nape of my neck. Cleary leaned forward, his hands clasped together. You've lived in this town for a long time. You must have known some of the victims personally. What can you tell me about them? I paused for a moment, recalling their names, their faces, the fear I had instilled in the community before I expertly replied. I didn't know them well, just acquaintances from the neighborhood. It's tragic what's happened. Tragic indeed, he murmured, scribbling something in his notebook. But you must understand there's a pattern emerging in these cases. We need to know if anyone seems suspicious to you. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I couldn't let it show. Suspicious? No, it's a quiet town. People are generally friendly. You know how it is. I chuckled lightly, hoping to ease the atmosphere. Cleary's gaze narrowed. You must have heard something. Any rumors? Anything at all? Honestly, Detective, I've been so busy with work and my family. I haven't heard much beyond the usual gossip, I replied, forcing the words out with feigned nonchalance. Just then, the door creaked open and Karen, a neighbor from down the street, stepped in. Her eyes darted between Cleary and me, and I could see the gears turning in her mind. Am I interrupting? She asked, her voice laced with uncertainty. Not at all, Cleary replied, straightening up. We were just discussing the recent incidents in town. Do you have anything to add, Karen? I felt my heart race as I watched her hesitate. I've seen some strange things around here lately. The other night, I noticed Dennis leaving the house at an odd hour, she stated, her gaze shifting to me. I just thought it was strange, that's all. Cleary's interest piqued. What time was this and where did he go? I don't know, she admitted, fidgeting with her hands. But it was late and I had a bad feeling about it. I thought maybe I should mention it. I turned to her, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. Karen, come on. You know how it is. Sometimes I have late meetings or errands to run. It's just part of life. Yeah, but it just seemed off, she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. Cleary nodded, jotting down notes. I appreciate you coming forward with that, Karen. It's important we gather as much information as possible. As they continued to discuss the recent events, I felt the walls closing in around me. Karen's suspicion was a crack in my carefully constructed facade, and I needed to do something. Later that evening, I found myself sitting on my porch, staring into the dimming twilight. My mind raced with the day's events. I had to regain control. I had to make sure Karen didn't dig any deeper. The next day, I saw Karen in the grocery store. I approached her, a friendly smile plastered on my face. Hey, Karen. I wanted to talk to you about the other night. Oh, hey, Dennis, she replied, her tone hesitant. I appreciate your concern, but I promise you, there's nothing to worry about. It's just, you know how rumors can get started. She frowned, her brow furrowing. I just can't shake the feeling that something's wrong. Let's not let our imaginations run wild, I said, my voice soothing. I'm just a regular guy. You've known me for years. Trust me. As I walked away, I could feel her eyes on my back, her uncertainty lingering in the air. I knew I had to act fast. The net was tightening and I couldn't afford to slip through the cracks. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. My heart raced at the thought of what she might uncover. I had to remind her of the friendly neighborhood I had cultivated, make her doubt her suspicions. As I drifted off to sleep, a sinister smile crossed my lips. I was the quiet killer and I would do whatever it took to keep my dark secret hidden. The tension in Wichita hung thick in the air as the police finally received a breakthrough. I could sense the change, the subtle shift in energy that rippled through the community. It was as if a storm was brewing just beneath the surface, ready to erupt. I sat in my living room, the flickering television casting eerie shadows across the walls, as the news anchor reported on the ongoing investigation. The mention of DNA evidence linking me to one of the murders sent a chill down my spine, but I maintained my composure, clenching my fists on my lap. Dennis, did you hear that? Paula called from the kitchen, her voice trembling slightly. They found DNA. They're saying it could be connected to that poor girl? Yeah, I heard, I replied, trying to sound casual. But they're grasping at straws. We've been through this before. It's probably just a coincidence. Coincidence? This is serious. She stepped into the living room, her brow furrowed in concern. You've been acting strange lately. What if, Paula? I interrupted, my voice firm. You're letting this get to you. Just because there's a killer on the loose doesn't mean it's anyone we know. You need to stop worrying so much. I forced a smile and thankfully she seemed to relax a bit, though I could see the doubt lingering in her eyes. After all, I was an expert at manipulation and I had honed my skills over the years. Meanwhile, Karen, the intrepid girl from the neighborhood, had taken it upon herself to investigate my activities. I couldn't help but admire her bravery, or was it foolishness? I had seen the way she watched me, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. It made my skin crawl, yet it also fueled my dark delight. It was almost amusing how close she was to the truth, yet so far from understanding the gravity of her findings. Dennis, can I talk to you for a minute? Karen's voice sliced through my thoughts one afternoon as she approached me in the park. I feigned casual interest, but inside I was a whirlwind of anxiety. Of course, Karen. What's on your mind? I asked, maintaining an easy smile. I've been doing some digging and I think I've uncovered something important. Her eyes were fierce and for a moment, I felt the icy grip of fear. The police have no leads, but I've connected some dots. I've been following your movements. Your movements? That sounds a bit obsessive, don't you think? I chuckled, but it felt hollow. You should let the professionals handle this. I can't just sit back and watch, she shot back, her voice rising. People are dying, Dennis. You might know more than you're letting on. I leaned in closer, lowering my voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Karen, you need to be careful. People have gotten hurt trying to play detective. You don't want to put yourself in danger. Her eyes flickered with uncertainty, but I could see the determination lingering beneath the surface. She was a firecracker, and I had to extinguish that flame before it lit the entire town ablaze. Fine, she said, crossing her arms defiantly. But I'm not giving up. I'll find out the truth, it's just a matter of time. As she walked away, I felt a surge of adrenaline. The police may have been closing in, but I was not one to be easily cornered. I had learned how to slip through the cracks, how to create distractions that left people oblivious to my true nature. That night I devised a plan. I would create a diversion that would pull the town's attention away from me, a distraction so compelling that it would keep them occupied while I prepared for my next move. A fire? A staged incident? The possibilities were endless. I chuckled to myself, envisioning the chaos that would ensue. Little did they know, the quiet killer was right under their noses, hiding in plain sight while I orchestrated my escape. The thrill of the hunt, the exhilaration of evading capture. It was intoxicating. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I felt a strange satisfaction wash over me. The darkness within me was alive, and I knew I had to keep it hidden a little longer. The game was far from over. The community center buzzed with the low hum of conversation and laughter as families gathered for the annual fall festival. I stood in the corner, clutching my camera, the weight of the world pressing down on my shoulders. The autumn leaves outside danced in the breeze, but inside the air felt thick with tension. I had been documenting my father's behavior for weeks now, my instincts screaming that something was terribly off. I could hardly believe the depth of my suspicions, but every instinct I had told me that the man I called Dad was hiding something monstrous. "Hey Amy, you're missing out on the pie-eating contest," my friend Beth called, her voice bright and cheerful, cutting through my thoughts. I forced a smile, trying to blend into the festive atmosphere. "Yeah, I'll be there in a minute," I replied, but my eyes were glued to my father across the room. He stood casually by the refreshment table, chatting with neighbors, his laughter ringing out like chimes in the wind. How could he appear so normal, so charming when I knew what I knew? Behind the mask of a devoted family man, I felt the shadows of his true self lurking. "Why don't you join us, Amy?" Beth's persistence brought me back to reality. "Just taking some pictures," I muttered, raising my camera as if it were a shield. My heart raced as I thought about the evidence I had collected, the notes, the photos, the disturbing patterns I had uncovered. I couldn't let my guard down, not now. Detective Cleary entered the room, his presence commanding immediate attention. The room quieted as he moved to the center, his expression serious. "Thank you all for coming. I have something important to discuss." I felt a chill run down my spine. My father's demeanor shifted subtly, the smile fading as he locked eyes with the detective. I could see the tension radiating off him like heat from a fire. This was it, the moment I had dreaded but also anticipated. "Over the past few months, our community has faced a tragedy that we can no longer ignore," Cleary continued, his voice steady. "We have credible evidence linking several recent murders to someone within this community." He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. I could see my father's fingers twitching, a sign of his growing unease. "Who?" someone shouted from the back. "Dennis Rader," Cleary said, his voice unwavering. "The evidence is compelling and we are taking steps to ensure the safety of our community." Gasps echoed through the room. I watched as my father's face twisted in a mixture of disbelief and anger. "This is absurd," he shouted, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "I've done nothing wrong. You can't just accuse me like this." "Dad, please," I whispered, feeling the weight of his gaze. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew I had to step forward. I had to confront him with everything I had found. "Detective, I have something," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "I've been documenting my father's behavior. I think he's involved." The room fell silent, all eyes on me. I felt every heartbeat echoing in my ears, but I pressed on. "I have notes, photos, evidence." "Evidence?" Cleary's eyes lit up with hope. "What kind of evidence?" I took a deep breath, pulling out my notebook. I've been tracking his late-night outings, the strange phone calls, the way he always seems to know about local news before anyone else does. He's been lying to us all. Dennis's face contorted in rage. "You're making a mistake, Amy. You don't know what you're talking about." "Do-e." I shot back, my voice rising. "You think I enjoy doing this? You're my father and I can't just sit back and watch you destroy lives." As tension crackled in the air, Dennis made a move to back away, his eyes darting toward the exits, but Cleary stepped forward, blocking his path. "You're not going anywhere, Dennis." In that moment I felt a rush of defiance. I stepped closer to my father, my heart racing with fear and determination. "You're a monster and you can't hide anymore. You might have fooled everyone else but not me. Get away from me," he yelled, his voice sharp and menacing. I could feel the weight of his anger, but I stood my ground. Detective Cleary reached for his radio, his voice steady as he called for backup. "Dennis Rader, you're under arrest for the murders of multiple victims. You have the right to remain silent. As the reality of the situation sank in, I felt a mix of relief and horror. The man I had loved my entire life was being taken away, and all I could think about was the betrayal that had shattered my world. "Dad!" I yelled, tears streaming down my face as they cuffed him. "How could you?" But he merely glared at me, his eyes cold and devoid of remorse. In that moment, I realized the quiet killer had been hiding in plain sight all along, and the man I thought I knew was gone forever. Story 3. I stood in my backyard, staring at the fence that separated my property from Greg Miller's. It was just a wooden barrier, a simple structure meant to delineate boundaries, but today it felt like a wall between sanity and madness. The sun hung low in the Texas sky, casting long shadows that danced across the grass, but all I could see was that fence. Damn it, it was too close. "Hey Greg!" I shouted, my voice echoing in the stillness of the late afternoon. He was out front, fiddling with his lawnmower, his back turned to me. I felt a surge of irritation course through my veins as I watched him ignore me. After a moment he turned, wiping the sweat from his brow. "What do you want, Mike?" His tone was casual, almost dismissive. I stepped closer to the fence, my heart racing. "You need to move this fence back. It's encroaching on my property. It's not just a few inches, it's a good foot." Greg chuckled, shaking his head. "Come on, man. You're making a big deal out of nothing. It's just a fence. You really want to fight about this?" My blood boiled. "It's not nothing, Greg. This is my land. You can't just put your fence wherever you want." He shrugged, the smirk never leaving his face. "Maybe you should just chill out, Mike. It's not worth getting worked up over a few boards." I could feel my face flush with anger. "You think this is funny? I'm trying to resolve this like an adult." "Adult? You're acting like a child." His laughter echoed in the air, and I felt my fists clench at my sides. "Funny how you have no problem laughing when you're the one at fault?" I shot back, my voice rising. "Fault? You sound ridiculous, man." He waved dismissively and turned back to his lawnmower. I stood there, my breath coming in short bursts, watching him. How could he be so nonchalant? This was my home, and I felt like he was trying to take something from me. I turned away, feeling defeated but also more determined. I needed to find out what my rights were. Later that night, I sat at my kitchen table, my laptop open in front of me, the glow of the screen illuminating my face. I typed furiously, searching for local property laws and regulations. The words blurred together as frustration crept in. Encroachment laws, property lines, fences. I muttered to myself, the phrases swirling in my mind like a storm. I took a sip of my coffee, but it tasted bitter on my tongue. My eyes darted to the window, catching a glimpse of Greg's house across the way. Was he watching me? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. My fingers danced across the keyboard, and I found a forum discussing property disputes. "It's common for neighbors to argue over fences," one user wrote. "But remember, you have rights." I leaned in closer, my heart racing at the thought of taking action. As I read, my frustration morphed into something darker, something more dangerous. "I won't let him get away with this," I whispered, my hands trembling slightly. The once trivial matter of a fence had transformed into a personal vendetta. I slammed my laptop shut, the sound echoing in the quiet of the house. Lisa, my wife, walked in, her brow furrowed with concern. "Mike, are you okay? You've been at that computer for hours." "I'm fine," I snapped, the edge in my voice startling even me. She stepped back, her eyes wide. "You don't seem fine. You're just obsessing over a fence. It's not worth getting worked up about." "Not worth it," I shot back, rising from my chair. "You don't understand. He's trying to take what's mine." "Mike," she hesitated, searching for the right words. "It's just a fence. Let it go." But I couldn't let it go. I felt the weight of the injustice pressing down on me, and I was determined to fight back. As I paced the kitchen, I could feel my mind spiraling, the darkness creeping in. This wasn't just about a fence anymore, it was about respect, about standing my ground. I glanced out the window again, my heart pounding. Greg's house loomed in the darkness, a reminder of the conflict that had just begun. Little did I know, this was only the start of a battle that would consume me entirely. The days following my confrontation with Greg felt like a surreal nightmare. I found myself drawn to the window, peering through the curtains like a voyeur in my own life, convinced that Greg was deliberately taunting me. Each time I spotted him in his yard, a wave of anger surged through me. He was out there, trimming his hedges, laughing with his stupid friends, while I was trapped in this prison of my own making. I felt like a fool, but that didn't stop the obsession from taking root. One afternoon I stood at the window, my hands clenched into fists. "What are you up to, Greg?" I muttered under my breath. My heart raced as I saw him toss a frisbee to his dog, completely oblivious to the storm brewing on the other side of the fence. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was mocking me, that every smile he flashed was a jab at my sanity. I flicked on my computer and scoured the internet for anything that could bolster my case against him. Property lines, local ordinances, anything to give me an edge. The weekend rolled around, and I reluctantly agreed to attend a neighborhood barbecue that Lisa had been planning for weeks. "It'll be good for you, Mike," she insisted, her voice laced with concern. "You need to socialize, meet people." I grunted in response, my mind already made up. I would confront Greg. It was time to put an end to his torment. As we arrived, the aroma of grilled burgers wafted through the air, mingling with the sounds of laughter. I scanned the crowd, my eyes landing on Greg, who was surrounded by a group of neighbors. He looked so relaxed, so carefree. Rage bubbled within me and I could feel the heat creeping up my neck. "I'm going to make a scene," I whispered to Lisa, but she shook her head, her eyes wide with apprehension. "Please don't," she implored, grabbing my arm. "Just enjoy the day." But I was past reasoning. I pushed through the throng of guests, my heart pounding in my chest. "Greg!" I shouted, my voice cutting through the laughter like a knife. The crowd fell silent, all eyes on me. Greg turned, his expression shifting from surprise to amusement. "What's up, Mike? You finally decided to join the living? Enough of your games." I snapped, my hands trembling. "You're stealing my property and I want you to stop." His laughter echoed around us and I could feel the heat of embarrassment wash over me. "You've got to be kidding me. It's just a fence, man. Get a grip." "No, it's not just a fence," I shot back, feeling the tension rise in the air. "You're harassing me and I'm done with it." "Whoa, whoa," a neighbor interjected, clearly uncomfortable. "Let's all calm down here. It's a friendly barbecue." But I couldn't calm down. The anger I felt was primal and it surged through me like wildfire. "You think this is funny? You think you can just bully me and get away with it?" I turned to the shocked faces of our neighbors. "He's a thief. A liar." "Mike, stop," Lisa cried, but I was too far gone. I could see the disbelief in the eyes of our neighbors, and it fueled me further. I was drowning in my own madness and I didn't care who saw me. Greg rolled his eyes, clearly enjoying the spectacle. "You need help, man. Seriously. Help? From you?" I spat, disgust heavy in my voice. "You've got some nerve." The tension in the air was palpable and I could see the whispers starting. "What's wrong with him? Is he really serious?" I wanted to scream at them to make them understand that I wasn't the crazy one. Greg was the problem. As the barbecue started to dissolve into murmurs and sideways glances, I could feel my heart pounding. I was on the precipice, teetering between a world of sanity and a chasm of chaos. With every glance at Greg, I felt my mind unravel a little more, and soon, I was convinced that everyone was against me. I stumbled back to Lisa, who looked horrified. "Why would you do that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "You embarrassed yourself." "I was just telling the truth," I retorted, desperation creeping into my voice. "They need to know what he's really like." But deep down I could feel it, the gnawing dread that I was losing control. Little did I know, the threats would soon begin, anonymous messages that would only stoke the fire of my paranoia and solidify my belief that Greg was out to destroy me. The neighbor from hell was just getting started, and I was spiraling further into darkness. I stood in the produce aisle of the local grocery store, my heart racing and my palms sweaty. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting an unflattering glare on the fresh vegetables. It felt like the walls were closing in around me as I spotted him, Greg Miller, my neighbor from hell, casually browsing the apples as if we weren't embroiled in a bitter feud over a fence. My mind, already frayed from sleepless nights and paranoid thoughts, twisted into knots of anger. "Hey, Greg," I called out, my voice sharper than I intended. He turned, a smirk creeping across his face that made my blood boil. "We need to talk." "About what, Mike? Your imaginary property lines?" he mocked, tossing an apple into his cart without a care. I could feel the eyes of other shoppers on us, the tension palpable. I couldn't back down now. "Enough games. You're not going to get away with this. You think you can just encroach on my property and laugh about it?" I stepped closer, my finger jabbing in the air for emphasis, feeling my chest tighten with each word. "Wow, it's just a fence, man. Get a grip," Greg replied, his casual demeanor only infuriating me more. He leaned against his cart, a picture of nonchalance, while I felt like a volcano ready to erupt. "You seriously need to lighten up." "Lighten up? You've ruined my life. Do you even realize how much stress you've caused me?" My voice rose, drawing the attention of nearby shoppers. I could see their curious glances, their whispered conversations. I was making a scene and I didn't even care. Stress? Really? You're acting like a child. Maybe you should talk to someone about your issues, Greg said, his tone dripping with condescension. That was the last straw. I clenched my fists, feeling the heat of rage surge through me. Let's settle this like men then. Right here, right now. I shouted, the words spilling out before I could stop them. A hush fell over the aisle and I could see the shock on the faces around us. I felt like I was standing on a precipice, and one wrong step could send me tumbling into chaos. Are you serious? Greg laughed, but it was a hollow sound. You think you can take me on? In a grocery store? You'd embarrass yourself. Embarrassment? How about you try living with the constant stress you've caused? You think I'm joking? My voice broke slightly, a mix of frustration and desperation. I was losing control and I knew it, but I couldn't help myself. Before Greg could respond, a uniformed officer stepped into the aisle, his presence calming the chaotic energy swirling around us. Gentlemen, is there a problem here? He asked, his gaze shifting between us. Nothing we can't handle, Greg replied, straightening up and flashing a toothy smile that didn't reach his eyes. I could feel the anger boiling inside me, ready to spill over, but I knew I had to rein it in. I didn't want the police involved, not in this public spectacle. The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly sensing the tension. I suggest you both cool down before this escalates further. We don't need any trouble in here. As the officer turned to leave, Greg leaned in closer, his voice low and threatening. You really want to make this worse for yourself, Mike? You're only digging your own grave. I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over me like a shroud. My hands trembled at my sides and I wanted nothing more than to retaliate, to lash out, but the fear of further consequences held me back. Instead, I nodded stiffly, retreating into my own mind, knowing that I had crossed a line. After that confrontation, I felt even more isolated. As I drove home, my thoughts spiraled in a dark direction. The walls of my house felt like they were closing in, and the familiar comfort of my home had turned into a prison. I sat in my living room, staring blankly at the walls, my heart heavy with the realization that I was spiraling deeper into obsession. The thought of Greg, the way he laughed, the way he dismissed me, consumed me like a wildfire. I retreated further into myself, my family's concern growing by the day. It was easier to shut everyone out than to confront the reality of what I was becoming. The more I isolated myself, the more I plotted my revenge against Greg, convinced that if I didn't act soon, I would lose everything. One night, as I rummaged through the garage, I stumbled upon something that would change everything. A hidden weapon I had forgotten about, wrapped in dust and shadows. My heart raced as I held it in my hands, a dangerous resolve igniting within me. This was the answer to my prayers, a way to reclaim my life. I knew then that I was on a path from which there would be no return. The confrontation I had dreamed about was no longer just a fantasy. It was a plan, and it was coming whether I was ready or not. The atmosphere in our neighborhood had shifted. It felt as if a storm was brewing, and I was standing right in the eye of it. Greg was relentless, throwing loud parties that pulsed through the night like a heartbeat, the bass reverberating in my chest, igniting an anger I couldn't contain. I could hear the laughter and shouts spilling over the fence, and it felt like he was mocking me, testing my sanity. Each night, the sounds of revelry crept into my mind, a constant reminder of my perceived defeat. Mike, you're getting worked up over nothing, Lisa said one evening, her voice soft yet firm as I paced the living room, my hands clenched into fists. She tried to catch my eye, but I was too far gone, lost in the fog of my rage. Nothing? He's doing this on purpose, Lisa. He knows what he's doing. I snapped, the words tumbling out like venom. The fear in her eyes only fueled my anger. Just let it go, please. Let's focus on us, on our life, she pleaded, her voice breaking slightly. I could see the worry etched on her face, the lines of stress deepening with each passing day. I can't just let it go. I won't be bullied in my own neighborhood. I shouted, the words echoing around the room like a challenge thrown into the void. I could feel the walls closing in on me, suffocating me with the weight of my own frustration. That night, as I lay in bed, the sounds of Greg's party still ringing in my ears, I made a decision. I had to confront him, to reclaim my territory. The hidden weapon in my garage felt like a lifeline, a promise of power. I could picture it, cold and heavy in my hands, a means to an end. It was time to take action, to show him that I wasn't the weakling he thought I was. Mike, please don't do anything rash, Lisa said, her voice trembling as I prepared to leave the house. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed protectively over her body. We can find a way to resolve this without violence. Resolve? He's not interested in resolving anything. This is about dominance, and I refuse to be his punching bag. I shot back, the words slicing through the air as I brushed past her. My heart raced as I stepped into the dim light of the garage, the shadows wrapping around me like a cloak of determination. I retrieved the weapon, its weight reassuring in my hands. I could almost hear the whispers of encouragement from the depths of my mind, urging me on. As I stepped out into the night, the cold air bit at my skin, but I welcomed it. It was a reminder that I was alive, that I was still capable of fighting back. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the neighborhood. I moved through the darkness, each step fueled by a mix of adrenaline and desperation. I could hear the muffled sounds of the party next door, music blaring, laughter echoing. It felt like a taunt, a challenge I had to meet head-on. I approached Greg's house, the laughter growing louder, more boisterous with each step. As I stood there, hidden in the shadows, I wrestled with the turmoil inside me. What if this goes too far? A small voice in my head whispered. But the louder voice screamed back, this is the only way. Suddenly the door swung open and Greg stumbled out, a drink in hand, his laughter spilling into the night air. My heart raced as I stepped forward, revealing myself from the darkness. Greg! I shouted, my voice laced with a mix of anger and fear. He turned, surprise etched on his face, and I could see the amusement fading as he registered the look in my eyes. What the hell, Mike? He said, his tone shifting to one of irritation. Can't you take a joke? This isn't a joke. I yelled, the weapon clutched tightly in my grip. You think you can just walk all over me? You think you can ignore me and throw parties like I don't exist? Seriously? You're going to threaten me over a fence? This is pathetic. Greg laughed, but there was an edge to it, a flicker of unease that I clung to like a lifeline. It's not just about the fence. I felt the anger boiling over, my voice rising with every word. It's about respect. You've crossed a line, and I'm done letting you trample all over me. The laughter faded from Greg's face, replaced by a look of incredulity. You need to get a grip, man. You're making a fool of yourself. No, Greg, you're the fool, I spat, stepping closer, the weapon now visible in the dim light. This ends tonight. In that moment, I felt a rush of clarity. I was no longer the meek accountant, no longer a victim. I was ready to fight back, ready to reclaim my life. But little did I know that the confrontation would spiral into something far darker, a moment that would change everything. The air was thick with tension as I stood outside Greg's house, the moon casting an eerie glow over everything. My heart raced, pounding in my chest like a war drum. I could feel the weight of the weapon in my hand, a cold, metallic promise of resolution. I had convinced myself that this was the only way to end the nightmare that had become my life. I could hear distant sounds of laughter from a party across the street, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just a few feet away. Greg! I shouted, my voice breaking the stillness of the night. We need to settle this once and for all. The lights in his house flickered as he appeared in the doorway, a silhouette against the warm light inside. Mike, you're being ridiculous. Just go home, he yelled back, his tone dripping with condescension. Ridiculous? You think I'm ridiculous? My grip tightened around the weapon as I stepped closer, my pulse elevating with each passing second. You've pushed me to this point. You think you can just trample over my life and get away with it? Greg stepped out onto his porch, his expression shifting from dismissive to something more serious. Do you really want to do this? You're making a huge mistake. Am I? Or is this where you finally face the consequences of your actions? I could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by anger. Put that down, Mike. This isn't the answer. Greg shouted, his voice rising. I laughed, a hollow, bitter sound that echoed in the night. Oh, but it is. You've made my life a living hell, and now it's time for you to understand just how serious I am. In that moment, the world around us faded, leaving just the two of us locked in this deadly dance. I could see the gears turning in his mind, and then it happened, the flash of metal from his waist. My heart dropped as he pulled out his own gun, the barrel glinting ominously in the moonlight. Step back, Mike. I don't want to hurt you, but I will if I have to. Greg's voice was steady, but I could hear the tremor beneath it. Is this how you want it to end? I shot back, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and adrenaline. You think I'm afraid of you? You think I won't pull the trigger? Don't test me. Greg shouted, his eyes wild with a mix of anger and fear. Time seemed to freeze as we stood there, two men on the brink of destruction. The quiet of the night was punctuated only by our heavy breathing. With every second that passed, the weight of our choices loomed larger, threatening to crush us both. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, drowning out the laughter from the party, the chirping crickets, everything. Just walk away, Mike. This isn't worth it. Greg pleaded, his voice softer now, almost desperate. Walk away. No, I'm done running from you. I took a step forward, the weapon raised, my mind racing with the adrenaline of the moment. This ends tonight. And then it happened. In a flash, the tension snapped. I don't even know who fired first. The loud bang of gunfire shattered the night, echoing through the neighborhood like a thunderclap. I felt a jolt, a sudden heat spreading through my body. I looked down and the world tilted. Greg! I shouted, my voice cracking, but it was too late. The realization crashed down on me like a wave and I stumbled back, feeling the cool grass beneath my feet. The sounds of the party faded into silence, replaced by the ringing in my ears. Panic surged through me as I processed what had just happened. I fell to my knees, the weapon slipping from my fingers and clattering to the ground. My heart raced and I looked up to see Greg collapsing onto the porch, his face pale and his eyes wide with disbelief. The chaos unfolded around me in a blur. I could hear distant sirens approaching, the sound growing louder as the reality of the night settled in. I was lost in a sea of horror, unable to comprehend how everything had spiraled so far out of control. The neighbor from hell had become a nightmare that I had never imagined. The world was closing in, and the only thing I could see was the lifeless form of Greg sprawled out, the consequences of our choices hanging heavily in the air. I sat in the courtroom, the air thick with tension as the jury filed in. My heart raced, each beat echoing the chaos of the past few weeks. I never imagined I would find myself here, facing the consequences of that fateful night when everything spiraled out of control. The prosecutor's voice droned on, detailing the events leading up to the confrontation with Greg. I could feel the weight of their judgment, the eyes of strangers boring into me as they tried to piece together the man I had become. Mike Thompson, the prosecutor began, you claimed self-defense, but evidence suggests otherwise. I clenched my fists, my knuckles turning white. How could they not see the truth? The harassment, the constant provocation. Greg's actions had pushed me to my breaking point. I glanced at the jury, their expressions a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. I could almost hear their thoughts. Was I a victim or had I become the monster? The courtroom was a stage and I was trapped in a dark play I never auditioned for. Your Honor, I finally spoke, my voice strained but steady. I did what I had to do to protect myself. Greg was a menace and I had been living in fear. My words hung in the air, but I could see the doubt flickering in their eyes. The defense attorney stood, pacing the floor like a predator, his voice smooth and calculated. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I urge you to consider the context of this case. Mike Thompson was not the only one with a motive for conflict. He gestured towards the evidence board, where photographs of Greg's past confrontations with neighbors were displayed. Greg Miller had a history, a pattern of harassment that finally culminated in tragedy. I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe they would understand. Maybe they would see that I wasn't the only one with a vendetta. But just as quickly, that hope was snuffed out when the prosecutor stood again, producing a series of threatening messages that had been sent to my phone. Messages that Mike Thompson received, he said, his tone dripping with disdain. We have reason to believe these were orchestrated by someone close to him. Someone who had her own motives. My stomach dropped as I realized what he was implying. Lisa. I glanced at her, sitting in the front row, her face a mask of composure. But I saw the flicker of something, an emotion I couldn't quite place. Guilt? Fear? I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the courtroom was not the place for such revelations. Days passed in a blur of testimonies and cross-examinations. Each moment felt like an eternity, and as the trial wore on, I began to notice the cracks in Lisa's facade. She was too quiet, too still, and every time the prosecutor mentioned those messages I could see her flinch. It gnawed at me, the suspicion that she might have played a part in this twisted game. Then the day arrived when the defense presented its final argument. The attorney leaned over the jury box, his voice low and conspiratorial. What if I told you that the real villain in this story isn't Mike, but rather the person who has been pulling the strings from the shadows? The gasps rippled through the courtroom, and I felt the weight of their eyes shift towards Lisa, her expression unreadable. Just as the jury was about to deliberate, a shocking revelation came to light. A witness, a neighbor who had been too afraid to come forward, stepped up to the stand. I saw Lisa the night before the shooting, she said, her voice trembling. She was texting someone and it didn't seem innocent. I think she wanted Mike to confront Greg. The courtroom erupted into chaos. My mind raced as I processed her words. Lisa had her own agenda? The messages weren't just threats from a mysterious figure. They were a plot to drive me deeper into conflict. Your Honor. I shouted, desperation in my voice. This is insane. Lisa wouldn't do that. But deep down, doubt gnawed at my resolve. What if she had manipulated me all along? The jury deliberated, whispers circling like vultures. As I looked at Lisa, I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes, and for the first time I questioned everything I thought I knew. The cycle of violence and betrayal was far from over, it was just beginning.